Much of the suffering in the world and in any community is caused by the highly intelligent who act without feeling and conscience. So wrote Fred Heckinger, former education editor of the New York Times. And of course, many of these highly intelligent people in the world who cause much of the suffering in the world have advanced degrees. How can this be? It raises some significant questions, I think. For example, can one be considered to be an educated person if one has little or no concern for other people, and if one has little or any integrity? And secondly, is it possible that diplomas and degrees are not a very accurate measurement of a person's education? It's not uncommon to judge a person's education by how much schooling they've had. Is there a better way to judge the level of one's education? Today's program, which is part 4 of my series entitled, What Are the Most Important Things We Can Learn?, will focus on what the great thinkers in literature and philosophy and psychology and religion have said in answer to the questions I've raised. I think a good place to start would be with some ideas from the famous essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson and the great German writer Goethe. Emerson said this, and I'm quoting him: "Character is higher than intellect. Character is higher than intellect." And Goethe, sometimes referred to as the German Shakespeare, Goethe said that intellect without character is far worse than character without intellect. The idea is that how a person behaves is much more important than how much knowledge he has or she has. Anthropologist Ashley Montagu, I think, provides some illumination here. He said that education is essentially the development of the ability to care for others. And the Jewish sage Hillel also provides some help, I think. He said this. It's a very famous quotation from him. Perhaps you're familiar with it. Hillel said, "If I am not for me, who will be? But if I am for me only, what am I?" You might wonder, why care about other people? Why care about other people when many people don't care about you or care about me? Well, I think there are a couple of good reasons to care. Among them are the following. I think it's fair to say that life can be empty and stale if one is totally self-absorbed. And secondly, the lack of concern for others can result in an ugly society and world. Allow me to give an example of what can happen in an advanced, so-called educated society when there's a lack of concern for justice. I have here in front of me a real letter written by a former inmate of a concentration camp in Nazi Germany to a teacher, and I think you will find it illuminating. The letter writer says, "I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes have witnessed what no man should see. Gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they seek to make our children more humane." And in the United States, abolitionist Wendell Phillips gave a very famous address at Harvard University in 1881. It was the Phi Beta Kappa address at Harvard. It was entitled, the scholar in America, and Phillips, who had spent so many years before the Civil War fighting for the abolition of slavery, attacked many American scholars for their lack of social leadership and moral cowardice. He said in his speech at Harvard that so many of the scholars at Harvard had done little or nothing in the pre-Civil War period to advance the movement to abolish slavery. And then he pointed out that the faculty at Harvard, as he was speaking in 1881, was for the most part doing very little to advance the cause of women's rights, specifically the right of women to vote. Phillips, in this famous speech and attack on scholars, said that the duty of a scholar is to help those less favored in life, He went on to say this, and I'm quoting Wendell Phillips: "College-bred men should be agitators to tear a question open and riddle it with light, and to educate the moral sense of the masses." Holocaust survivor Victor Klemperer also criticized German professors and other intellectuals during the Nazi period for their apparent indifference to injustice. Victor Klemperer kept a diary from 1933 to 1944 entitled "I Will Bear Witness." And in this diary, he said that all around him he saw professors and intellectuals who abandoned reason for self-interest and who cozied up to the Nazis. Phillips, in his diary, proposed what he considered to be the proper punishment for intellectuals and professors. And he said this, and I'm quoting Victor Klemperer: "If I were to determine the fate of the Germans, I might let ordinary Germans go, but I would have all the intellectuals strung up, and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest. They would be left hanging from the lampposts for as long as was compatible with hygiene." Elie Wiesel is perhaps the most famous Holocaust survivor. Wiesel teaches at Boston University. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And he has commented, Wiesel has, on the Christian housekeeper his family had in Hungary. He points out that when the Nazis took over Hungary, the police began raiding Jewish homes. And his family's Christian maid, a woman named Maria, offered to help the family. She said that she would find a home in a remote hamlet to hide the family. But Wiesel says that his family never anticipated the cruel things the Nazis would do, so they didn't take her up on this invitation for help. Later, when his family was moved out of their home and restricted to a Jewish ghetto, Wiesel mentions that this Christian woman, Maria, would thread her way through barricades and barbed wire to bring fruit and vegetables to his family. And Wiesel, in commenting on Maria, says this, and I'm quoting Elie Wiesel: "I think of Maria often with affection and gratitude, and with wonder as well. This simple, uneducated woman stood taller than the city's intellectuals, dignitaries, and clergy. Of what value was their faith, their education, their social position, if it aroused neither conscience nor compassion?" Let us consider for a moment the post-Civil War period in the United States, specifically the period from 1890 to 1960. or the 1960s. This was a period historians often refer to as the Jim Crow era. And why so? Well, Jim Crow, as you know, is a euphemism for segregation. This period of time, from 1890 to the 1960s, was a period when segregation was imposed on black people in the South by law. There was a cradle-to-the-grave system of segregation whereby black babies were born in black or hospitals for black people. They went to schools for black kids. And when they died, they were buried in cemeteries for black people, in contrast to the white population. The whites were born in so-called white hospitals, went to white schools, and were buried in white cemeteries. Also, of course, in this period, black people were conditioned to feel inferior to white people. In fact, some people claim that the greatest tragedy of racial segregation was the conditioned inferiority that black people suffered. So we had a situation in the South for many years where there was democracy for white people, but there wasn't democracy for black people. And it raises the question, which is connected with the theme of this program, and the question is, where were the professors and the educated clergy and the educated politicians in the South? Why weren't they speaking up for justice? Martin Luther King Jr., in a very famous letter, perhaps the most famous letter he ever wrote, entitled Letter from a Birmingham Jail, addressed himself to this issue. In 1963, King led a protest march in Birmingham, one of the most segregated cities in America. And he was arrested for leading a peaceful protest and was placed in jail, in fact, in solitary confinement for a while. And while in jail, he wrote a letter to the white clergy in Birmingham, Alabama, indicting them for their indifference to the black cause. And he said this, and I'm quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, I felt I would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents. All too many have been more cautious than courageous. In the midst of blatant injustice inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the sidelines and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard many ministers say, these are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern." End of quote. It is interesting that more than a few white clergymen in America saw no connection between the Gospels and fighting social injustice, when Jesus was very clear on this issue. In Matthew 5, in the very famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says the following, and I'm quoting him, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I must add that following Dr. King's letter, which got much publicity in the media, many white clergy, many priests, ministers, and rabbis did come to Reverend King's assistance and did march with him. So his letter apparently did have a very significant impact on the civil rights movement. Thus far, I've talked about some educators, clergy, and politicians who have seemingly been indifferent to injustice. But we know that in recent years, more than a few big business executives also have shown a lack of concern for justice. and we know that the media has reported that more than a few CEOs and their allies have engaged in very unethical behavior at the very least, and indeed in criminal behavior at the worst. And we also know that some of these business executives engaging in unethical and sometimes criminal behavior are graduates of some of the most prestigious universities in America. Which raises this question: do graduates of the so-called prestigious universities in America tend to be more honorable people than the graduates of less prestigious universities and colleges? It also raises some other very important questions. Among them are the following. Are people with doctorate degrees, with PhDs specifically, are they generally more honorable people than people who have master's degrees? And people who have master's degrees, are they generally more honorable people than people who have bachelor's degrees? And our college graduates in general, do they tend to be more honorable people than people who are just high school graduates? These questions remind me of a very important idea that comes from contemporary psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. And he wrote this sentence, which I'm going to quote in a moment, in his most famous book called The Road Less Traveled, a book that was on the New York Times bestseller list, and deservingly so, for more than 10 years. Peck says this. He says, "Love, courage, and wisdom cannot be certified by academic degrees." Again, love, courage, and wisdom cannot be certified by academic degrees. Isn't it true that one can have all kinds of fancy degrees and be an unloving person? Isn't it true one can have degrees from the most prestigious universities in the world and be a coward? Isn't it true one can have all kinds of degrees and lack wisdom? How is that possible, that one can have all kinds of degrees but lack wisdom? Well, one may have a PhD in biology or history or psychology, but yet not deal very well with the daily problems of living, not deal very well with one's anger, with one's fear, with one's envy, and as I said, with the daily adversities. I wonder if M. Scott Peck's words should be inscribed over the entrance to every university in the world. Imagine for a moment if they were, and if one were to enter every university in the world, and perhaps above the archway to read his words. Again, love, courage, and wisdom cannot be certified by academic degrees. This raises another significant question, and that is, does one's ability to love reflect one's level of education? Again, does one's ability to love reflect one's level of education? And what do I mean by love? Love, of course, has many definitions. I'm using the definition of love presented by ethicist Joseph Fletcher, who used to teach at Brown University. And Fletcher has defined love as justice. He says that love and justice are the same thing, that when you love someone, you treat the person fairly. And when you don't treat someone fairly, well, obviously, you're not loving them. I wonder if there is such a thing as an educated heart. I wonder if there is such a thing as an educated heart. And I wonder if perhaps people such as Mother Teresa and Albert Schweitzer and Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. and whistleblowers of all kinds and political dissidents, people, for example, fighting totalitarianism in China. I wonder if these kinds of people should be sent to the head of the class. Is it true that graduating with honors often has nothing to do with being an honorable person? How about a statue dedicated to whistleblowers in Harvard Yard. Or perhaps this statue to whistleblowers should be placed right outside of the entrance to the College of Business at Harvard, and perhaps at other prestigious universities as well. I think that Immanuel Kant and Francis Bacon provide some important summary comments to what I've said thus far in my presentation. Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher, said this. He said, "A just person is the noblest product of creation." And Francis Bacon, very famous British essayist, Bacon said this. He said there would be no gain to humanity, there would be no gain to the humanity if the extension of knowledge brought no gain in benevolence. One of the things I've omitted to talk about in the three previous segments of my series on education, and have neglected to talk about today, is the role of computers in education. After all, so many people today believe that computers will transform education, and some people believe they'll even make children and adults smarter. Well, let me pursue this issue for a moment of computers. Where do computers fit in the educational framework? Can computers teach us the most important things in life? We know that computers can provide us with considerable information, a great deal of information. But of course, besides information, we also need insight. And I think it's fair to say that it's very rare that a computer can provide us with insight. For example, computers can't teach us what we should value in life. Computers can't teach us the best way to deal with our personal problems. Computers can't teach us the best way for one to live. And of course, computers can't teach us to better understand ourselves, other people, and life. The ancient Greeks believed that the most important learning in life was to learn to understand oneself. I've mentioned in previous segments that a very famous maxim that has come out of ancient Greece, and in fact was inscribed on one of their temples, is "Know thyself." And Freud and Schopenhauer, Kant, Jung, Adler, so many thinkers have emphasized this Greek idea of knowing oneself, and they claim that one of the most important things about getting to know oneself is getting to know which values are most appropriate for oneself. We all have values, we all have value systems, and it's important for us to determine which values are best for us. And in this context, again, computers can't teach us what gives life meaning. Computers can't teach us the answer to the question, should I be religious? Should I be religious? And if so, how? And which religion should I follow? And of course, computers cannot teach us the answer to the question, how important should sex be in my life? And how can I best use my leisure time? The German philosopher Schopenhauer emphasized the idea that a common mistake that so many people make in learning, in studying, is that they go after information. They seek information but don't realize that the purpose of the information is to come up with insights, that the insights are actually more important in a certain sense than the information. And Schopenhauer said this, allow me to quote him, again, the German philosopher author Schopenhauer, quote, "Students and learned men of every kind and every age go as a rule in search of information, not insight. They make it a point of having information about everything. It does not occur to them that information is merely a means towards insight and possesses little or no value of itself." Since we have a couple of minutes remaining, what I'd like to do is to do something I haven't had much time to do in previous segments, and that is to recommend some books and essays that you might find helpful in pursuing on your own some of the topics that I've discussed in my segments on education. And the first few books I'll be recommending now relate very much to the theme of today's program. I would highly recommend Nelson Mandela's autobiography. It's entitled Long Walk to Freedom. He began writing it, by the way, he began writing it during his 27 years in jail. Also, I would highly recommend Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography. It has the interesting title, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And I mentioned before Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Perhaps certainly one of the most famous letters ever written by an American. And if you want to access the full context of the letter, because it's a pretty long letter, Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography, has this letter it has the entire letter in it. Also, of course, I would highly recommend the Holy Bible, and with regard to today's segment, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, as it applies to some of the themes that I pursued today. And also, of course, Aristotle's Ethics. And need I forget, a very famous essay by Henry David Thoreau. If you have read nothing by Thoreau, I suggest that if you want to read an essay that provides a very good summary of his ideas, read his essay entitled Life Without Principle. Again, Thoreau's essay entitled Life Without Principle. I'd like to close with a reminder from Thoreau that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau wrote, "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."